And Sean, do we want anyone to give introductions?
Um, I think we're past the introductions now, Jerry. We'll just get going.
Okay, here we go. All right, good morning, everyone. This is Jerry Muir, and today we are going to go through our VITA session number 4. This will be California centric this morning, and we'll talk about a number of things that you'll see at the VITA site pertaining to California returns. Here are our objectives. And when you hear the term standard deduction is a statutory amount, and that's going to be different for California from the federal government. I think I mentioned before, when you think of federal taxes and California taxes, think of two different animals, a cat and a dog, and that way you'll always be okay. But again, there are standard deductions for California, which are different. There are personal exemptions and dependency exemptions for California, and we'll talk about those. We'll also talk about the healthcare mandate. This is something you'll see for each and every taxpayer because California has a law that says individuals who file returns have to have some type of health care, and that's under the Affordable Care Act, which came out back in 2010. Then we'll talk a little bit about filing information and filing statuses for the state of California, talk about selected income items, address just a little bit about California itemized deductions, talk about some of the various credits. So when you hear credits, you will have non-refundable and refundable credits. And again, think of the cat and the dog analogy. You have different rules for the federal government, different rules for the state government. And then, of course, you'll be familiar with the Form 540. And the Schedule CA is a schedule that accompanies the 540 for California. Then we'll talk about some other topics, and then we'll review that return that is included in the PowerPoint. I did check yesterday, I checked earlier this week, I checked this morning, and the Link and Learn for tax year 2024 is only showing the federal return. And so if you want to prepare a California state return with Link and Learn, right now your only game in town is going to be the tax year 2023. Don't know when the IRS is going to have that ready to go, but I would imagine pretty quick. All right, our Zoom session today will go to noon and we'll take breaks at approximately 10 and 11 o'clock. Okay, to my knowledge, and Sean will keep me honest here, I don't know if there's any changes to the cast of characters for the VITA team, but these are the folks that you'll be talking to, bumping into, seeing at the VITA site. And again, as I mentioned before, the St. Killian's VITA is pretty unique. They got a very detailed list of folks who help out, a lot of experience. And so I think you're going to be in great shape if you're one of those new or newer volunteers. And if you're coming back, then typically you know most of these individuals who have been working with the St. Killian's VITA site for a number of years.
So there is going to be one change, Jerry. Teresa Jackson from Orange County United Way was promoted to a different position with the United Way, but we don't know who her replacement will be. Sorry about that.
All right. So Teresa Jackson is leaving and someone else will take her place. And that's pretty typical. You have new folks coming in and out for United Way. Okay. Thank you, Sean. Okay. This is a very busy slide. So we'll talk about some of these items and they may be of use to you or maybe use to the site coordinator. And so when you're talking about the Franchise Tax Board, they have what is called a site map. And that site map was updated, about a month, almost 2 months ago. And what it is a very detailed landing page, if you will, that talks about credits, deductions, and income. And so if you get stuck in something and you're looking for a resource, that is a resource, the FTB site map. And they do a pretty fair job of updating it. And again, a number of topics to include credits and deductions and income. Right now, and I went scouring the internet trying to find the tax year 2024 California state return. and couldn't find a 2024. There's information pertaining to 2024, but not the return itself. So obviously that's forthcoming. But if you need to, for instructional purposes, if you need to review or return 2023, i.e. the template, it's on the internet. And then, of course, the big takeaway here this morning is the California Volunteer Reference Manual, and that's the VITA reference manual, known as the publication 5130. We're going to take a peek at that this morning, and that particular document, it's about 40 some odd pages, does a really good job talking about California taxes. And usually that's not a big issue, but every once in a while you get one of those $64,000 questions. And so your site coordinator, or perhaps maybe you, will have to dig into the Franchise Tax Board publication 5130 to find that state answer. There's another publication, and chances are the vast majority of us on the call are not going to use this. And this is the FTB publication 5135. This is for the military module. If you are going to certify, you probably want to talk to your site coordinator at the church. Typically, what happens, a lot of sites will have a few people who are certified on military. And then that way, if someone comes in, whether they be an active duty military person or reserve component military, or if they have a very basic, a very simple Schedule E as an echo for rental property, then we can assist them. And I think I mentioned before at my site at Coastline College in Garden Grove, all of our folks are typically certified on the military module. And so we can help out. Again, any active duty individuals, not a lot of them show up. Reserve individuals show up from time to time. And then again, that basic Schedule E as an echo. And when you think of that Schedule E, again, it's you have to be trained for the military module. And again, it's a basic rental property that we're going to complete. And one other thing, we in the VITA program, whether it's the military module or any other module, we do not calculate depreciation. And you may get that question from time to time, and the response to that question will be, we are not trained to calculate depreciation, so we don't do it. All right, and of course, there's a knowledge test. This is similar to the knowledge test from last year. So don't know if the site coordinator wants you to take the California knowledge test, but it is posted. And the last time I looked, I think it was about 15 questions, pretty basic questions for California. And then probably another go-to document is the Franchise Tax Board publication 1001. This is a voluminous publication. It has many, many different topics. And when you see the California adjustments, what that means is, again, the cat and dog analogy, California has their own tax law. It's called the Revenue and Taxation Code. And there's certain things that California will not tax, and sometimes California will tax. And for example, the federal government, they're going to tax what are called unemployment compensation. And they're going to tax all of it for tax year 2024. State of California does not tax unemployment compensation. And so you'll probably get that question. And again, you can use my analogy, or you can simply say the state of California has different rules, different laws than the federal government. And again, that 1001 does a really good job talking about the many, many different topics where you're going to take deductions on California that you cannot take on the federal return, or certain income items that are not subject to California tax and they're taxed by the federal government. And then every once in a while, you got to dig into what is called the FTB publication 1005, talking about pensions and annuities. You may have use of that from time to time. Residency status is usually not an issue in VITA, because at St. Killian, just like at my site, we're going to prepare returns for California residents. We do not prepare returns for part year returns. We do not prepare returns for non-California residents, just California residents. So that's typically not an issue. And then we mentioned before that at the VITA site, we help people out as best we can. We'll give them information. We do not advocate for them. And that's something that you want to stay away from, because once you start advocating, you're in a different lane and you want to, again, stay out of that lane. But part of the information that we provide individual is California, the Franchise Tax Board sometimes will send a letter to the taxpayer asking for what is called additional information or documentation. And California will say, hey, we want to send you a California refund. However, again, additional information is needed from the taxpayer. So the taxpayer will get that letter. And when they get that letter, then of course they have to respond to it. And again, this is the information that we can share with our VITA clients. If a taxpayer gets a letter from either the Franchise Tax Board or the federal government, then it behooves that VITA client to open up the letter, read it, and then respond to it. And I'm the first to admit, I mean, I've been a government awarded the government for many years, and sometimes government letters are confusing at best. And so your VITA client has different options. Again, we don't advocate for them. One option would be maybe to call the FTB or call the IRS directly and say, hey, I got this letter. What am I supposed to do? Because and that's what happens when you get a letter from the government. Typically, the government says you need to take some type of action. And that's the word that attorneys use, shall or will, not or shall, excuse me, must or will. There we go. And so again, you want to make sure you educate your clients. If they receive letters, they need to respond to those letters. And if the response to the taxing agency doesn't work out, then sometimes the clients have to go to a paid practitioner and say, I got this letter, don't understand it. What am I supposed to do? But again, a lot of your clients, or I should say, some of your clients are going to get this Franchise Tax Board letter 4502. And that's one of many letters that come out from the Franchise Tax Board. And I'm not sure how your site coordinator is going to handle it at St. Killian's, but again, because we don't advocate, we just provide information. If someone gets a letter, they need to respond to that. And again, there's different ways to do it. Telephone, you can actually, in this presentation this morning, there's contact information for the Franchise Tax Board, whether it be telephonic, online, or by letter or in person. And then we also are going to talk about the health coverage for California. And when you have a VITA client show up at the VITA site, we are going to help them prepare their California return. Most of the individuals will have a filing requirement, and that means they're going to have some type of health coverage. And typically individuals do. Low-income individuals, indigent individuals, usually they'll have Medi-Cal, which is a program. And like anything in life, you have to qualify for it. Medi-Cal would be for that low-income individual or family, and they're provided medical care at no cost to themselves. The taxpayers pick up the tab for that. Okay, if you are new or newer, then chances are you've heard about the Lincoln Learn certification program. Things have changed remarkably for this particular season. Lincoln Learn has a new look. It's been redesigned, more colors. And so when you talk about the Lincoln Learn certification, if you're going to be a VITA volunteer, you still have to go through what we call certification, which starts off with the volunteer standards of conduct, and then it goes to the intake and interview, and then the basic and the advanced modules. And then some of your individuals will certify at a higher level. Again, at my site at Garden Grove, we certify our folks at the military level. And then the practice lab, usually not a big change for this particular year, but you still have to create an account if you've never used the practice lab before. And what it is the practice lab is based on the TaxSlayer Pro tax preparation software platform. That's the same platform that I use for my tax practice. And so if you want to use the practice lab, you can use it, but again, you have to register. Most people don't have a problem with that. Some people do, and if you're one of those people that has a problem providing your contact information, then you're going to have to use some other type of tax preparation software to practice. But again, the practice lab, it's user friendly. The data that's collected by the contractor for the IRS is not shared with other folks, so you're not going to get a call on a Saturday to sell you some shampoo. It's a contractor collecting information. You may get a survey. That's about it. And then again, the 2024 tax preparation software is available now, so you can start certifying. However, the state return for California is not yet available. And then as you go through the Lincoln Learn and the practice lab, there are tutorials, and those are helpful. There's also practice returns and solutions. Stay away from any practice return that is married filing separate. In California, the VITA program, we do not prepare married filing separate returns. And if you get that questions from taxpayers, the response would be, we are not trained to do that. And you're going to get a lot of people asking you questions, why don't you do that? And it's going to be like a broken record. You're going to explain to the individual, we are not trained to do it. VITA program is basic taxation. And if you have a more complicated return, then that most likely is going to be outside of the scope of VITA. And that means the taxpayer has certain options. They can do it themselves. They can go to a paid practitioner. They can go to someone else. But again, the VITA program is basic tax preparation. All right, Sean, I'm going to hesitate for a moment and see if you have any questions or any comments.
No, all the questions were regarding the slide deck, which I posted again. So it's in the chat for anybody who needs it.
Okay. All right. And so when you're talking about California, this information is in your California VITA guide, which we'll talk about shortly. But the standard deduction, most of your VITA clients will take the standard deduction. Some individuals take the itemized deductions, but the standard deduction, there's a dollar amount that's assigned to that, and that dollar amount will go up year after year. So the amounts that appear on the screen, this is a standard deduction based on the filing status. And again, it's completely different from the federal standard deductions. Again, the cat and the dog analogy. Personal exemptions, you might remember when we went through the returns, federal return, there is no dollar amount assigned on the federal return for a personal exemption, or for that matter, a dependency exemption. That no longer exists on the federal return. The reason we're concerned about dependency exemptions on the federal return are tax credits that are associated with dependents. But on the California return, you have these exemption amounts, which we're going to talk about when we prepare the return for Lisa and Mario Trevino. So again, these are the dollar amounts, and these dollar amounts, you don't have to memorize them because they are embedded in the software and they're going to pop out automatically for you. But again, if you do get a question, you can simply refer your VITA client either to the return or some type of information. And I would usually, what I do when individuals have questions, I'll simply open up for the federal side of the house, the publication 4012, on the state side of the house, the publication 5130. Okay, Sean, I think at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reload the 5130. So hold on just a moment.
All righty.
If I have it up and ready.
And then just so
Here
all
we
the
go.
volunteers know, the site coordinator always has a physical copy of those in the reference room.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea to have hard copies, but it just depends. Some people, especially youngsters, they love everything electronic, and I'm okay with that. But either one, when you have a hard copy or an electronic copy, whatever works for you. A lot of times I'll have publication 4012 in the hard copy format because I will make notes to it, and again, whatever works for you. But this is Sean, can you see it where it says a
Oh
California
yeah,
volunteer? Okay.
yeah, we've got it.
So this document is published by the Franchise Tax Board, and the Franchise Tax Board usually does a really good job with their reference manual. It's updated every year, and you can see this is page one where it gives you the basics. So let's talk about a couple things. Try not to make you too dizzy as we go through this. And so there's a number of things. Again, providing information to taxpayers is important, not advocacy. We don't do that. But a lot of times individuals say, I've got a question, or I want to talk to a live person at a state franchise tax board office. Well, the local one is in the city of Santa Ana. I actually been there before. I don't know why I went there, but I've been there before, and that's again in the city of Santa Ana. And so that's one way to contact the franchise tax board. Most people will do it most likely online. And then when you're talking about the hotline, this is probably more for your site coordinator. The volunteer hotline would go directly to a franchise tax board employee. And again, usually it's your site coordinator who's going to be making the call. And that top number there, which is 800 522 5665. That would be for volunteers, site coordinator going to the franchise tax board. And if you've never been on the website, I think the franchise tax board does a pretty good job with their website. I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And a lot of your taxpayers can get their answers going to the franchise tax board website. Every once in a while, you'll bump into a VITA client who has limited means, and so, again, providing information, usually it's been my experience, you can go to a public library. You can usually get either a free or a no cost library card, and then you usually have access at least 1 hour a day on the internet. Because there are some people out there who can't afford the internet, and so they go to a public library, and that's how they can access the Franchise Tax Board website. And then by correspondence, sometimes individuals want or need to write the franchise tax board. And so there's an address there. My education for clients, my non-paying clients, my VITA clients, I always tell them, if you get a letter from the franchise tax board, you want to respond to it. If it says you must do this, then you want to read the letter and then respond to it. And it's been my experience, both as a taxpayer and as a tax professional, when I contact the franchise tax board, I usually get pretty good service. They usually know what they're doing. And so again, your VITA clients, when they contact them, typically they're going to get the assistance that they need. Just a couple more things here. Uh, you can obviously establish an account. A lot of people do, and this is something for probably not a lot of your clients, but the franchise tax board, among other things, they want you to pay what you owe electronically. I had a client who made a substantial payment not too long ago. He was sent a letter said, "Hey, if you do this again, we'll take your money, but we're also going to penalize you because you're paying by check." And that's kind of a new thing. If the thing's been around for a couple of years. So again, usually you want people to pay obviously what they owe. You want them to pay promptly or timely, and there's a way to do it electronically, and of course, it's a lot safer. And there's that web pay. And when you're talking about paying with a credit card, I guess it depends on who you are. If you owe something, typically you want to pay it. And yes, if you pay by credit card, then that means you're borrowing money from the credit card company to pay your tax. And that could be a vicious cycle. But again, there's different ways to pay. If you are going to pay with a credit card, that's available to you. But of course, then it begs the question, how are you going to pay off your credit card? So again, it could be I think it's I forget the saying, a dual-edged sword, something like that. This is other information that would be very beneficial to your VITA client because a lot of times what happens, individuals owe the franchise tax board and they ask you, "Hey, how can I pay this?" And you'll say, "Well, there's different ways to do it. You can make full payment. If you can't make full payment, then you can make what is called installment payment. So you'd sign up for an installment agreement. The IRS has the same thing. And the whole idea between or behind an installment agreement, think about the automobile loan that you may have had in the past or currently have. You go buy a car, you put down a down payment, you finance the rest. That's kind of like the installment agreement. You may put down a small amount. Let's say you owe 10 or 15,000 to the state of California, and then you sign up for an installment agreement where you're paying your tax over time. And Again, that's something that some of your clients want to do. One thing you don't want to do, especially with the state of California, if you owe them money, you don't want to put your head in the sand. Because if you do that, the state of California, it's been my experience over the last probably 30 years, they're pretty good at collecting what is owed to them. And for example, if you go on their franchise tax board website, they actually have, and this is per California law, they have a laundry list of California taxpayers who owe the franchise tax board money, and in some cases, a lot of money. And they publicly shame these individuals because they haven't paid their tax. Now, chances are your VITA client's not going to get on that list because we're talking about people owing a lot of money. But again, the franchise tax board has a lot of different ways to collect, and in some cases, publicly shame taxpayers. More information here regarding making your payments. And then just real quick, when you're talking about scope of VITA, this is another thing that you'll bump into both on your federal return and sometimes your state return. Because it's a basic tax preparation program, we only work with certain types of taxpayers. And if you've ever talked to a tax professional or a very seasoned VITA professional, they know that the tax world is a very, very large world and you have to narrow your scope. And that's exactly what VITA has done. They've narrowed their scope. And so you'll see that. And again, when you're asked the question, why won't you help me with this particular return? The answer is it's outside of the scope. Yet there are options available. But again, we can't help you because, again, we're not trained to do that. Let's see. I think that's probably about all we need to do. But again, when you're talking about 2024, usually your VITA volunteers are concerned about that new year. And so on page 15, this is where it starts talking about the new tax year, and this is for tax year 2024. And you probably want to get into that frame of mind when you see a year, you want to call it tax year, or sometimes they'll refer to as a tax season. But we're in tax year 2024 for the current year, tax season 2025. All right, Sean, any questions before we jump into back to the PowerPoint?
Not a question, but I'll just make a general comment about the letters from the California Franchise Tax Board. If you move, they're going to send it to the address where you filed your taxes, and the post office doesn't forward those letters, so you can get into trouble pretty quick if you don't let the franchise tax board know when you move, because they'll send that letter and then 60 days later they start garnishing your wages. So I've had people run into that problem.
Yeah, that's a real good point. And in this publication that's displayed, it does talk about the change of address. And so when your VITA client moves, it behooves them to contact their friends and family and their people that they owe money to, and the federal and the state government say, hey, I've moved, here's my new address. Because the last thing you want to do is have a battle with the franchise tax board. And eventually they're going to say, well, we sent all the information to the last known address. And you may say, well, I've moved. And the FTB says, yes, you have moved. And you didn't provide us with the current address. Most people, when they move, they file a return the next year and they figure, okay, that's notification to the FTB and the IRS that I've moved. I always tell my clients, if you move, contact IRS, contact FTB and tell them there's actually a form you can use. I have moved and here's my new address. And I recognize it's a little extra time, but again, you want to avoid issues with the taxing agencies. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so again, these numbers are the numbers that you will find in that publication that we just left, the Franchise Tax Board publication 5130. Okay, so back to the California healthcare mandate. There's a lot of information when you're talking about the healthcare mandate. This came out, oh, about almost 5 years now. And what it is, California says that you have to have health insurance. And when you file your California return, you're going to tell California that you have health insurance. And so I'm thinking probably just about everybody on the call here probably has some type of health insurance. And there's many, many ways to get health insurance. So one way a lot of working adults get health insurance is they'll have it through their employer. And the employer may pay a portion, or in some cases, maybe all of the health insurance premiums. And then that means the employee has minimum health insurance. Another way to do it is, again, if you're low income, and we see a lot of low income individuals in the VITA program, and they may be on Medi-Cal, and they're covered, their family's covered, and what they have is when they go to the doctor, they're covered. There's no out-of-pocket expense, if you will. Another way to be covered is, let's say you're a veteran, you can get coverage. Of course, there's certain limitations with the Veterans Administration. I know a guy who's low income, very low income, and his primary doc is a Veterans Administration doctor, and he's had everything from flu shots to open heart surgery provided by the VA. And then, of course, another way you can get it, we do have some self-employed individuals, perhaps maybe they call a broker, a insurance broker, and they sign up for some type of health insurance. And then you'll have a lot of individuals at the VITA site who will have what is called Covered California. And Covered California is part of that Affordable Care Act that came out in 2010. And the Affordable Care Act was a voluminous piece of tax legislation and other types of legislation. And one thing it did, it established that federal marketplace to buy health insurance. And then, of course, it also allowed the states to set up their own program. And that's exactly what California did. So California has Covered California. And with Covered California, you can get that health insurance at minimum essential coverage. And then, yes, you have to pay a little bit of health insurance premiums. And then the taxpayers will subsidize the rest. And so again, that's that healthcare mandate. And we'll go through an example today before we conclude. But this is the bottom line. And when you're talking about documentation, your VITA client will come to the site and you'll ask them, hey, do you have minimum essential health coverage? And a lot of them will. They'll either be in Covered California, or they might be on Medi-Cal, or maybe some type of health insurance. And so they're going to provide you with a document, or maybe they're going to have some type of insurance card. And if they have an insurance card from Medi-Cal, then that's good enough for government work, so to speak. And then at the very bottom, there's a document. And if you're newer, and you've never seen Covered California documents, you're going to see individuals with an IRS form 1095 alpha. And that is the Covered California document, which shows the amount of premiums that the taxpayers paid and the amount of subsidies that the taxpayers have received from the taxpayers. And again, that 1095 alpha, non-negotiable. And so when they come to the site and they go, I'm in Covered California, then that's going to beg the question, where's your 1095 alpha? If they don't have one, then obviously, we can still help them out, but we got to go get that. Maybe they're going to go get it that day, or maybe they're going to come back next week. But they need the 1095 alpha for us to prepare a return, because your tax return is a reconciliation. And part of that reconciliation, you need certain documents. And if you're in Covered California, the 1095A is one of those documents that you need. Okay, and then just a couple things. Sometimes you're going to be overwhelmed with paperwork, and eventually, what happens, you'll kind of figure out what's needed. But when you're in Covered California, you're going to be issued, or you're going to have the opportunity to download that Form 1095 Alpha. That's what the client needs to bring if they're in Covered California. Whether they're in Covered California the whole year or part of the year, they're going to have that 1095A. And again, without that, we cannot prepare a return. So for example, at the site that I work in, when individuals show up and they say, I'm in Covered California, we ask them for the 1095A. If they go, I don't have it, And we start a conversation. Well, did you get it? Can you get it? Come back next week with it, and we'll be able to help you out. We want to help you out. We have the ability to help you out, but we need that document. And then sometimes you're going to have individuals with other documents, and you can see on the screen here the 1095B or 1095C. And then sometimes you're going to have that brief discussion of what type of coverage do you have, and that would be the coverage for everybody on the return, mom, dad, and kids. Typically with minor children, mom or dad are going to have some type of coverage for them. And then when you're talking about the health coverage, a lot of your clients are going to have full year health coverage. For partial year health coverage, then you're going to have to get into your California return and indicate that you have partial year coverage. And that's something that you will see from time to time. But I would say it's been my experience, the vast majority of VITA clients are going to have some type of coverage. And again, the low income individuals usually have Medi-Cal. And when you're talking about seniors, not everybody, but I think about 99.99% of your seniors are going to be on Medicare. And every once in a while, you're going to bump into a senior who does not have Medicare, but usually most of them do. And the coverage rates are usually pretty good. I think last year, if I remember correctly, most seniors in the VITA program, I think they pay a couple $1,000 for Medicare coverage. And then that document toward the bottom, that's a California document, the healthcare exemption. And so if you don't have some type of healthcare, then you've got to qualify for an exemption. And if you don't qualify for an exemption and you don't have healthcare, then you have to pay that California individual share responsibility payment. And I've seen that a few times at the VITA site. Usually individuals have coverage or they meet an exemption. So here's a laundry list of your health care or health coverage exemptions. And usually when you're talking about an exemption in the VITA program, it's going to be an individual who is either indigent or they're very low income. And the bottom line is they can't afford it. And so that would be one of those exemptions. And then sometimes you have exemptions that are actually processed by Covered California. And this is another important thing, probably talking about educating individuals. Covered California, it's a huge program. And the last time I looked, they have individuals, a lot of times they're at nonprofits and they're called navigators. And what these individuals do, these navigators, they help out individuals get into Covered California, update their Covered California account. And the bottom line is getting health coverage for low and moderate income individuals. That's really important. I mean, if you've ever dealt with medical bills, and or if you ever gone to the hospital and they go, yeah, we're going to help you out, but we need to make sure that you have some type of health insurance or you have to pay in advance. This can be disconcerting for low and moderate income taxpayers. And so again, Covered California, it's out there, and there are a lot of people who are eligible for it. And then sometimes, again, the navigator will help them out. But you can get an exemption in Covered California. Most likely, you'd have a navigator helping you out. Okay, and again, the penalty, I've only seen this a few times at the VITA site. And when we have individuals come to our VITA site and they go, I don't have insurance, we'll ask them a series of questions. And a lot of times we determine they are indigent or again, they just can't afford it. And every once in a while, I think I've seen this a couple, three times, people say, I don't have insurance, I don't care. And there are people like that. They don't care. And if they don't care, which means they don't have insurance and they don't meet one of these exceptions, then they're going to have to pay this California individual share responsibility penalty. And then the software will calculate for them. Do keep in mind the federal government no longer has an individual share responsibility penalty. That went away a few years ago, but California does. And as it says on the screen here, there's a flat amount for adults and a flat amount per child. Of course, the parent's going to pay that on behalf of the child. But again, I think I've seen this maybe a couple, two or three times at the VITA site. Usually you won't see this. And what I'll do at my site, if someone doesn't have insurance and they say I can't afford it, we'll have a conversation. I'll take out the pencil, I'll start doing numbers, and we'll ask about other things that they're paying on, food, rent, things like that. And the vast majority of the time, we determine they simply can't afford health insurance. And then I'll go into that instructor mode, if you will, and I'll say, you know something, you and your family, you want coverage. And so you really should consider Cover California. Let's hook you up with a nonprofit, United Way as an example. Let's get you to a navigator, sit down and yes, you're going to purchase insurance. It's going to be low cost and it's going to be subsidized with taxpayers. But the bottom line is you want to get that insurance. Okay, filing dates, usually not an issue in the VITA program, but when you're talking about filing a return, and if you've been with VITA for a few years, the tax deadline, uh, it's sometimes, I think one year, a few years ago, we went all the way to July. I think the other year, I think it was all the way to November for a lot of taxpayers. But right now, the due date for California is April 15th. If that's extended because of some natural disaster or some calamity of some kind, then what will happen is you will be notified by the Franchise Tax Board. And then, of course, the site coordinator and the powers to be at the church will make a decision whether or not to extend the season. But right now, April 15th, that's that due date. And of course, California does have what is called a paperless extension. And so we're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be around till October 15th at the church. I think we wrap up operations in the middle of April. But again, for that paperless extension, you have until the 15th of October to file your California return. However, if you owe tax, you got to pay it by the 15th. Otherwise, there's penalties and interest that you're going to be paying. And that's the same concept for your federal return. And usually what happens at the VITA site, because we're doing basic returns, we're going to go ahead and get everything done before the 15th. And again, not all, but most VITA sites, they'll close their doors at the end of the tax season. And then if someone needs assistance, they'll usually contact the United Way. The United Way will provide them with information pertaining to sites that are open either year round or past April 15th.
Jerry, did you want to take any questions?
Sure. If you have a question, I'll give it a whirl.
So Elizabeth McAdams had a question about clients being fined for partial year coverage that was omitted under the Covered California program. So I think you've
Yeah.
kind of covered it, but are you going to be going over how the software, how you actually process the exemptions? Or I guess
Yes,
that's,
we'll open up the California return and we'll show we'll show that portion of California.
but that's probably not going to work today, though, right? California is not loaded in.
We're focused on the 2023 tax year
Oh,
because it
okay.
has
All
both the
right.
federal and the state. Yeah.
Okay.
So as they say, for instructional purposes only. All right. Anything else, Sean?
So there's another question. Partial year coverage is penalized. So do you want to explain that, Jerry? I
Yeah, the short answer is when you don't have that full year coverage, then what that means is you got part year coverage, and if you have part year coverage, then you may be subject to a penalty. But again, there's all these exemptions, and so what you need to do, you need to have that conversation with the taxpayer and say, okay, why do you have a gap of 5 or 6 months? And they may say, well, I left my job and 5 or 6 months I didn't have insurance. And then maybe during that 5 or 6 months, they are low income and they cannot afford insurance. So that might be one of those exceptions.
Yep, I think that covers it. We just go month by month and answer the question why you didn't have it in January, why you didn't have it in February.
Yeah,
And
and
it,
then and again for a lot of times, and think about all the interviews that you have done either as an employer or as an instructor or a mom or a dad. A lot of times you're going to have that conversation, and sometimes individuals will provide you with information that doesn't pertain. I call it white noise, and so you listen to them, and then eventually you're gonna get the answer. But you have to have a conversation with the individual. And if someone says I'm broke, well, I'm a trained accountant. I said, okay, well, let's define your definition of broke. How much do you have in your bank account? What is your income stream? What are your expenses? Where do you live? And then your definition of broke might be different than my definition of broke, and of course, different than the state of California. So you have to have the conversation. You have to what I call develop the fact pattern. All right. Anything else, Sean?
oh, that's it. I think it'll help
Okay.
when we actually go through the software.
All right. Okay, talking about filing status. And so for California, and this is the general rule, and I think I've mentioned this before, you always have the general rule. So I like to use this example. In the state of California, the general rule to be a licensed attorney is you're going to go to college, and then you're going to go to law school, and then you're going to take the bar examination, and then you are now a licensed attorney in the state of California. That's the general rule. Well, here's an exception to the general rule. You do not have to go to college in California or anywhere else, and you do not have to go to law school to become a licensed attorney in California. Well, what you got to do is you have to then study. This is the exception. You have to study under an attorney or attorneys for a period of time and then take the bar examination. So you always have that in the tax world, you got the general rule and then you have exception or exceptions to the general rule. And you'll see that again and again and again. And so the general rule is when you're filing a federal return, let's say your filing status is married filing joint on the federal side of the house, then on your state return, most likely or generally, you're going to be filing married filing joint. So that's what you're going to see. Usually that's not a change for you in the VITA program. And then we're familiar with all these filing statuses. And probably the one that you'll spend, it's not complicated. I think it's a little bit more involved maybe, but you do have the resources, the 4012, and then of course the publication 5130. Probably the more involved one is going to be the head of household filing status. And again, you just follow the decision tree, and you'll be able to determine whether or not they qualify. And that's another term. A lot of individuals, and I'm like a lot of individuals. I think that something is the way it is, and that's not the case. Yeah, for example, head of household filing status, you have to qualify under the tax law for a particular filing status. And an individual may think, well, I'm this and I'm that. Well, you may be, but for tax purposes, you're not. And so that means, well, you haven't met the rule. You haven't qualified for head of household because you haven't met all the provisions, the tax provisions. And so that's where you want to kind of keep your tax hat on. And when you get those questions from individuals, don't be dismissive. Just say, well, you have not qualified for this particular filing status because of these reasons. And you can show them, and that's what I do. I show them whatever publication I have available, electronic or hard copy. I say, here are the tax provisions. Let's see if you can meet it. If you can't, we're going to have to go to the provision that you do meet. You're going to head of household is one that you're going to spend a little time with. And then you might remember if you're newer, when you're filing a joint return, you have what is called joint and several liability. And what that means is the government can go ahead and collect the tax from you as an individual, both you and your spouse. Maybe you got divorced and maybe there's that tax bill hanging over your head. Well, the government can come after you individually or both you and your spouse. And then California, I think there's a couple of other states also, but California has what is called a registered domestic partner. And so that means if you choose to register, you have to register with the Secretary of State in California, and it could be two men, two women, or a man and a woman, something like that. And that basically confers that almost that married filing joint status, if you will. But again, it's something that you have to you have to take an affirmative step and you have to register with the Secretary of State. And then we mentioned before, married filing separate, we just don't prepare those returns. And I'll be the first to admit, sometime like in my tax practice, I file married filing separate when my clients want to do it. And a lot of times it's very easy to do. But again, we're not trained to do that in the VITA program. And then for head of household, I think the reason California focuses on this is there's been a lot of abuse, and there's just a lot of abuse, period, when it comes to taxes. And one of them is that head of household filing status. So there's an actual form, the 3532, and that's embedded in your software. Okay, and then when you're talking about filing requirements, generally when people come to the VITA site, they're there because they typically want a refund, and so they're going to file. Individuals who do not have a filing requirement, it's going to be up to your site coordinator. But if they don't have a filing requirement, it means they don't have to file a return. But a lot of times individuals have tax withheld, whether it be federal and or state tax withheld, so they want to file a return to get that refund. But your requirements to file a return for California start on page 22 of the publication 5130. And what I do at my site, when an individual shows up and says, Jerry, I want to file a return, sometimes we'll educate them and say, well, based on the information that you've given us, you don't have a filing requirement. And a lot of times taxpayers will say, I don't care, I want to file a return. And we say, okay, have a seat, and we'll file the return for them. But we do educate them. We tell them you don't have a filing requirement. And some people, for whatever reason or reasons, they want to file a return at my site. If they want to file a return, we will file a return for them. Okay, and a couple things about California. We've already talked about that publication 1001. It's actually does an excellent job talking about California adjustments, and that's both for income and deductions. And there's certain things that you cannot deduct on your federal return that you can deduct on your California return. So, for example, let's say you have someone who comes to the VITA site and in a previous tax year they paid for tax preparation. Well, you can't deduct tax preparation on your federal return. That went away with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. But if you itemize on your California return, you can take a deduction for tax preparation fees that you paid. And that's an example of what is called conformity and nonconformity. And when you hear that term, it simply means that the federal government and the state government don't agree on certain things. And they don't have to agree because they have two different types of tax laws. And so again, you'll hear me talk about that term conformity and nonconformity. And there's also a term called partial conformity. For our purposes in the VITA program, you usually will never see that. And so things that California does not tax, and that's because of the California Revenue and Taxation Code. They don't tax interest on U.S. savings bonds. And there's different types of government securities and savings bonds. You might remember that maybe as a young adult or a kid, you'd buy savings bonds. I haven't bought one for a long time, but again, interest that you earn on a savings bond is not going to be subject to California tax. It will be subject to federal tax. And then here's something, and we'll show you in the software how this works. A state income tax refund. Individuals will come to the VITA site and they'll say, "Hey, I got a refund from the state of California." And you're going to say, "Great." And then they'll ask you, "Well, do I have to report this on my tax return?" And you're going to say, "Well, let's take a look at your previous year federal return, because if you took what is called a tax benefit on your federal tax return in the previous year, then either some or all of that California return is going to be, meaning the refund is going to be reported on your federal return. But on your California return, state income tax refunds are not taxed." And then unemployment compensation, you're going to see this a lot. I remember during COVID, just about every other return that we had unemployment compensation. But for unemployment compensation fully taxed by the federal government, not taxed by the state of California. And that's a sore point because some people will come in with unemployment compensation, and a lot of them have no tax withheld. And then they're going to look you in the eyeball and say, why do I owe tax to the federal government because I was on unemployment? And the answer would be, well, because you did not have any withholding and you had enough unemployment compensation that generated some tax in your federal return. Social Security, when you hear the term Social Security, usually you're talking about someone who's, I think right now, I think the age is 65, but that's a general rule. I know people who've been on Social Security in their 50s. There are exceptions to that, but the general rule is 65 or older. And then, of course, that's going up. But the bottom line is for your federal return, you're going to enter the data from that SSA 1099. That's a Social Security document. We have a lot of that in VITA. And then on your California return, no Social Security benefits will be taxed, zero. In some cases, a portion on your federal return may be taxed. Your software is going to do that. You simply enter the data from the SSA 1099. We don't see a lot of railroad retirement benefits, but when you talk about railroad retirement benefits, uh, the uh, the railroad people, if you will, they have a different retirement program, just like there's different entities in the United States. Like, for example, I know this fire captain, he's never paid a penny into Social Security. He has his own retirement plan from the fire department. And so you're going to see those exceptions. And so the tier one and tier two benefits are like Social Security, but again, they're for railway workers. And then, granted, not everybody wins the California lottery, but when you hear the term California lottery, a lot of people think about someone winning millions of dollars, and that's true. But like one time, I won the California lottery, and it was $70. And so you're going to have individuals who have a small amount. We know for California, it's not going to be taxed. On the federal side of the house, your California lottery winnings are going to be taxed in its entirety on the federal return, the Form 1040. And then some of the times you have to actually make a manual adjustment in the California return. Other times it's done automatically. So, for example, when you're talking about unemployment compensation, you will enter the data on your federal return and meaning the software will take care of your California return, meaning unemployment compensation is not going to be taxed on the California Form 540. Same thing with Social Securities, it's going to be done automatically by the software. Now, for California lottery winnings, whether it's $70 or $700, that is not an automatic thing. You're going to have to make a manual change to your California software to calculate zero California tax on the California lottery winnings. Okay, we're going to get into alimony. And let's see, Sean, I think I'll run through this slide and then we'll take a break.
Okay, sounds good. We did have a question. Do you want to do that now or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll give it a whirl.
All right. So somebody was asking if the couple is married, but they're separated at the end of the year and not living together, but their divorce isn't final yet. Can they be married filing joint?
Yeah, if you've got a married couple and they decide they look at each other and go, "You're not for me anymore," and they're in the process or the procedure of going through divorce, that means they're still married. And so at the end of the year, their marital status is they're still married. They may hate each other, they may live in separate residences, but they're still married for tax purposes. So if they choose to file a married filing joint, they can do so. And then of course what happens is a lot of people say, well, I don't want to file with my soon-to-be ex-spouse because that individual has some financial sins and I don't want to be on the hook for it. Well, at that point, then one of their options would be filing a separate return. But again, we don't do that in VITA.
And then another question was regarding all these non-conformances with California tax law, how much of that does the tax layer software figure out for us?
Well, probably the short answer to that question is the vast majority of your conformity issues are going to be addressed by the software automatically. Most of the time, you're going to see Social Security and unemployment compensation. So every once in a while, you'll have to get in, but I'd say the vast majority of the time, you're not going to be making those changes. But what's important is when someone says, I got this type of income. So, for example, lottery income,
Mm.
okay, and we know we have to make a change in the software. And just like alimony, which we'll talk about in just a moment here, this is another change that you'll have to make on the California return if you have it.
Yeah, and I would just add for the volunteers that are new or newer is really the software is much bigger than what we mostly will ever use. It does lots of stuff. The main thing is we have to ask the right questions so we know what to input. The 13614 form is great for the federal issues. For those weird California issues, most sites have a supplemental form that addresses the California stuff.
Yeah, and that's an important point when you're talking about preparing to return. It's not like everybody on the call here, including me, it's not like we're all tax geniuses. We're not. But what we can do at the VITA site, we can typically find that answer. And you're going to get one of those questions. I call them a $64,000 question. You're going to say, I don't know that. And this happens all the time. I mean, I've been preparing taxes and teaching taxes for about 35 or 40 years. And there are certain things that I don't know. And so I tell my clients, whether they're a VITA client or a paying client, let's look it up because you can always find the answer. And at the St. Killian's VITA site, you got a lot of experienced folks. I don't know if Adele is on the call here, but she is one of those individuals, very experienced, very knowledgeable, along with the rest of the folks. So you're in good hands when you do bump into that question that you're asked and you say, you know something, I don't know. But I think it's important when you're talking to someone about taxes, develop the fact pattern. And I'll be the first to admit sometimes you have to be very patient. I think patience goes a long ways. But once you develop the fact pattern and get the facts, then you can find the answer, whether you or the site coordinator or one of the SMEs, if you will, of the site. Okay, real quick, we'll talk about alimony. You don't see a lot of this at the VITA site, but when you do, it's going to make a difference. And so when you're talking about alimony, then you have to define what is alimony. Well, alimony is money that is paid typically to a former spouse, in some cases a current spouse, but typically a former spouse, and it is ordered by a judicial official who has the authority. And so that means you go to court, you get divorced, and then the judge says, okay, you are going to pay that person X number of dollars per month. And so alimony on your California return, it's a fully taxable event, period, and a discussion. And if you're paying alimony on your California return, you can take a deduction. Now, on your federal return, it's a different story. On your federal return, it depends on when that divorce occurred. And so in your federal return, let's say the divorce occurred back in 2017, 2016, on your federal return, then you're going to have to report alimony as a taxable event, and you can take a deduction for alimony paid. For newer divorces, and that's that middle section on the screen here, for newer divorces on your federal return, you're not going to report alimony paid and you're not going to be able to take a deduction. And so again, you have to define alimony. And then typically when people say, Jerry, I'm paying alimony, I usually will respond with, okay, is there a court award? Is there a document that's been issued by the judge? Let's take a look at that. Every once in a while, and I've seen this before, the attorneys will not use the term alimony. They'll use the term family maintenance. And at that point, then you have to determine how much is for the big person, i.e., the former spouse, and how much is for the little people. And the little people would be the kids, and that would be child support. Child support and alimony are two different animals. Child support is not reported on a return, whether it be federal or state. Alimony depends on when the divorce occurred. And again, the state of California, you are going to report alimony payments. We actually had a VITA client at the church, I think about 2 or 3 years ago. She came in and she was receiving alimony, a significant amount, at least for her. I think it was like 30 or 40,000. And I said, yeah, bad news is on your California return, it's a fully taxable event. Okay, I think that takes us to the break there, Sean. I got 10:05. You want to take 10 minutes?
Yes, let's do that. 10:05. We'll pause the recording.
Okay, we are back and we're going to start talking about gambling. This is something that you're going to see at the VITA site. And over the years, I remember when I first started VITA many years ago, I did not see gambling income. And now I see gambling income on a regular basis, not for every individual, because some people are opposed to gambling, but I do see gambling on a lot of VITA returns. And so when somebody gambles, that could be either at Las Vegas, it could be purchasing those lottery tickets in California, it could be going to the horse races, whatever the case is. If you win money at gambling, you're going to report that gambling winning on your federal return. On your California return, if you've won the California lottery, and there's different flavors, if you will, of the California lottery, but if you win that on your California return, it's not a taxable event. And so again, that's one of those examples of nonconformity for California. And then we do have individuals that go to the Native American casinos. There's a number of them. I think over the years, I think I've been down to Pala a couple times. That's in San Diego County. And so when you win there, well, that's not a California lottery. That's just winning if you do win, and that winning would be reported on your both your federal and your state return. And then here's another thing when you gamble, and again, I'm not a gambling expert. I go to Vegas maybe once a year, so I'm far from an expert. But when you do gamble, in some cases, you're going to be issued a W-2G, which is an information return. In other cases, it depends on the games that you play. You're not going to be issued any type of documents. So when you go cash out at the cash cage, they're going to give you currency and you're going to stick it in your pocket and walk away. So again, it depends. And that's why, as I mentioned before, when someone says I've won money, develop the fact pattern. Where did you win it? When did you win it? And what did you wager? And then that way, if they have a W-2G, then of course that's something you'll enter into the software and then make those adjustments if need be on your California return. Okay, and then miscellaneous itemized deductions. Thankfully, this is something you're not going to see a lot of, but when you're talking about the miscellaneous itemized deductions on your federal return, there's not a whole lot left as when we're talking about the changes to tax law about going on about 5 years now, maybe a little bit longer. But the bottom line is these changes on the federal return, the state of California still allows certain type of deductions. And again, that's an example of nonconformity. And so, for example, if you have someone who has paid tax preparation fees, not deducted on the federal return, but if they itemize, they can deduct it on their California return. And there's certain type of expenses that you can take on your California return. So again, it's important to develop that fact pattern. And you also want to know that when you're talking about a deduction, you get the standard deduction or the itemized deduction. And certainly you don't want to spend a lot of time if the individual has a California standard deduction. Okay, the credits, and this is something that you're actually not going to spend a lot of time with because your software is going to do the walking for you, if you will. But you want to have an awareness of these credits because if someone asks a question about the credit, you want to be able to give them just, basic information. And so for California, California has a number of credits, and these are probably actually the top five are the ones, or top six are the ones you're going to be seeing. Earned income tax credit, this is something you'll see on a lot of returns, and this is both the federal EITC and the state EITC. And this is for low and moderate income taxpayers. If they do not have children, in some cases, they can still get EITC, but they have to be very low income. And of course, if they do have one or two or three children, then typically that earned income tax credit amount is going to go up. But I always say when you look at the earned income tax credit, think of the normal distribution curve that you learned about. I think you learned about this in high school or maybe college. And so you have a few things on the left-hand side of the curve, a few things on the right-hand side of the curve, and a whole bunch of things in the middle of the curve. And that's kind of like the earned income tax credit. So if you make a little bit of earned income, you'll get a little bit of the credit. If you make a lot of earned income, you'll get a little bit of the credit. If you have a modest amount of earned income, then you'll get a larger credit. And then for California, there's a young child tax credit. Again, your software will calculate that automatically because you're going to enter data pertaining to the date of birth for the children. Foster youth, you don't see that very often, and but when you do, it's a credit that's available. The non-refundable renter's credit, this is something that, because it's non-refundable, that means it's a dollar for dollar reduction of the tax. If there is no tax, then they're not going to get any of that renter's credit, if you will, not going to have a tax benefit. And then the exemption credit, that's another credit that you're going to see. And then another big credit you'll see, a lot of people are going to work, typically going to work, and they're dropping their kids off at some type of daycare. And they're going to get both the federal child independent care expense credit and a lot of times the California child independent care expense credit. These other credits toward the bottom on your VITA returns, you're typically not going to see it. That's the head of household for joint credit or joint custody, dependent parent, and other state tax credit. You're just not going to see it on your California VITA returns. Okay, so let's talk about the earned income tax credit. And when you talk about the earned income tax credit, again, think of the cat and the dog analogy. Simply because someone qualifies on the federal side of the house for EITC, it does not mean they qualify on the state side of the house. And so because the EITC rules for the federal government are different than the state government. But again, your software will calculate this based on the entries that you'll make. And this is a good thing for your VITA clients. The maximum amount of, in fact, we'll show you on the next slide, the maximum amount of the credit is thousands of dollars for your California VITA clients. And so that's a good thing. And then when you add the California EITC with the federal EITC, in some cases your VITA clients will walk out the door with a refund of many thousands of dollars. And as it says on the screen, there's a California adjusted gross income limitation, again calculated automatically by the software. This is something you don't bump into very often, but when you do, you might get the question. It's called maximum investment income limit. And so if you've got some type of capital gains or what is called portfolio income, interest and dividends, unearned income, if you will, and if that investment income amount is over that 4674, that means even though the individual would have been eligible for EITC, they're not going to get it. But typically you don't see that because typically in the VITA program, individuals have very limited amounts of investment. And so you're usually not going to bump up against that limit. But if you do bump up against that limit, that's when the EITC for California will not be allowed. And then this third item, it's a little bit different because again, this is California now. It's a little bit different than the federal side of the house. You can actually be eligible for California EITC when you're 18 years of age. And so if you're 18, you're self-employed, or let's say you are 18 and you have earned income from a job, and you meet the other qualifications for California, you can get the California EITC. And that's different than the federal side of the house. Here's another thing when you're talking about EITC. If you have a valid individual taxpayer identification number, that ITIN, you may be able to get, if you meet all the requirements, EITC. And then probably the takeaway here is earned income. Sometimes individuals have a lot of unearned income. And that's the whole idea behind the earned income tax credit. You got to have earned income. And so again, think of wages as a wage earner or self-employment as a self-employed individual. And that's when you have earned income. Unearned income is, again, portfolio income, dividends, interest, capital gains distribution, something like that. Okay, here's the number, and every once in a while you're going to have a client, a VITA client, who has maximum EITC, and so this is a good thing for them. This is just California, and on the federal side of the house, that EITC max, I think it's well over $6,000. So in some cases, it is possible for your VITA client just in federal and California EITC to have a refund of $10,000 or more. It does happen from time to time. But again, these are the maximum EITC amounts. So if you have someone who's very low income and they have no kids and they meet the other requirements, they can get up to $294. And of course, for the individual who has 3 children or more, they can get up to that 3644 amount that's shown on the slide. And then the additional documentation, we talked about this. Sometimes the FTB is going to be sending out a letter and they're going to say, Dear taxpayer, we need additional information. And I'll be the first to admit, when I get a letter and say, hey, you need to provide information, it's frustrating because you got to sit down, you got to address it, you got to post the letter. But if your client gets a letter like this, and what I tell my VITA clients, if you get a letter, you want to respond to it. And if you don't understand it, then find someone in your life to help you out. And sometimes that means maybe a smart aunt, smart uncle, or maybe go to a tax preparer, tax professional, or maybe the low income tax clinic, someone who can help you out. But ignoring a letter is probably not a good idea, because if you ignore a letter, then that refund that's pending will be held by the state of California, and the state of California is waiting for the taxpayer to take action. And then at the very bottom, it talks about the refund is going to be withheld. And an example would be if you don't pay your child support. Something about paying child support. I've never paid it, and thankfully that's a good thing. But if you've paid child support, what that means is the government really wants you to adhere to that court action. And the government, whether it be the federal government, especially the state government, they have ways to make people paying child support. And in some cases, it's withholding a refund. And Sean, any questions? I see some chatter there.
Yeah, there was a question about whether family support includes alimony, and I
Yeah,
was
when you hear the
explaining that
term
it might.
family support, well, what that means is you have to get into the definition, because when someone says family support to me, then I'm going to say, okay, how much is for the big person? How much is typically for that former spouse? And how much is for the little people, the kids? And so family support, again, you get into that definition. And sometimes you do really have to dig into the weeds, because someone will provide a term to you, and then you've got to get the fidelity. What do you mean by that? And I mean, you can get into the California Family Code, and the California Family Code talks very specifically, because these are obviously statutory requirements. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I can do now.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so that's California EITC, which is a good thing for the VITA client. Now, the young child tax credit, you're going to see a lot of this, because obviously a lot of our VITA clients are typically younger adults, and a lot of them have kids. And so if you've got a kid that's under 6 at the last day of the year, and your client meets other requirements, then they're going to be eligible for this young child tax credit. But again, there are certain income limitations. And so when someone is knocking down a salary of maybe 55,000 or $60,000 a year, then there are certain credits that are not going to be eligible for. Now, the whole idea behind a lot of these credits, both federal and state, they're geared toward working adults who are of limited means. So, they're not making the big bucks, so to speak. So a lot of times these things are not available to our VITA clients that are making more money than not. And then the foster youth credit, I've actually worked with foster youth. I remember giving a presentation, and it's if you have not been in that world, it is an interesting world, and sometimes it's a little tragic where you've got a kid who their parents are either deceased, or a lot of times the parents have some type of mental or physical disability, and they're out of the picture. And so society is raising these kids hopefully to be, taxpayers, if you will. But anyway, the foster youth tax credit, it's alive and well in the state of California. There's income limitations and there's certain requirements. And so when you're talking to your taxpayers, if they meet certain requirements, and usually they're going to be eligible for EITC and they're at a certain age, they can get this particular credit. Okay, and this is something a lot of individuals are going to be eligible for, the renter's credit. The renter's credit is a non-refundable credit. And so when you hear the term non-refundable, it means a dollar for dollar reduction of the tax. And so as it says here, you have to meet certain requirements. And those requirements, obviously, there's income limitations. Your software will calculate that automatically. And you have to, of course, be a California resident, and we do that in the VITA program. And of course, there's AGI limitations. And then here's something, you got to pay rent for at least 6 months for property in California, and that has to be their principal residence, which typically would be an apartment or a home. And then as far as the non-refundable credit amount, it's $60 for a single individual, and then for other filers, it's going to be $120. Again, a non-refundable credit, which is a dollar for dollar reduction of the tax. And then you can see at the very bottom for those single taxpayers who rent, this is clearly within the VITA limitations because usually the VITA limitations is about $65,000, and that's written in jello. And so if someone is making 52,000 and change, they're going to qualify if they meet all these other provisions. They're going to qualify for the non-refundable renter's credit. So again, this is a nice credit that is available to a lot of individuals. Okay, and then the child and dependent care expense credit, you might remember this on the federal return. And so the rules are very similar, but again, the cat and dog analogy. And so you're talking about someone typically who's dropping off their kid so that individual can go to work. And of course, if the child is under 13, then what that means is you're going to be able to take this particular credit on your California return. And that's a general rule. Of course, there's also other exceptions if you have an adult who's physically or mentally incapable of self-care. And so that means if you have an adult at home and you leave the house, something bad's going to happen. That typically means they're physically or mentally incapable of self-care. And so that would be an example of that dependent care expense credit. And of course, there's certain rules that you have to meet. But this is something that, again, pretty much automatic on your federal side of the house. You'll enter that data and it'll carry forward to the California return. Okay, some other things, and this is probably more so toward education. When you're talking about estimated tax payments, and I get this all the time, you'll probably get this. People will ask you, why do I owe money on my California return? And the answer is usually going to be, well, because you made insufficient estimated tax payments or you had insufficient withholding. Because we have both federal and state, we have a pay-as-you-go system. And so when you're making money and you have insufficient withholding, and that could happen, or you haven't made estimated tax payments, then at the end of the year, there's a reckoning, and that reckoning means that you owe some tax. And so this happens a lot. And I get this, and taxpayers say, well, Jerry, what can I do? I said, well, there's a number of things you can do. If you're an employee, you can go back to your employer. You can have additional amounts withheld from your paycheck. If you're self-employed, you can make additional estimated tax payments. And if you're an employee, you can also make estimated tax payments. So there's different ways to meet that obligation. And typically, when you're talking about the obligation, you want to pay 90% of your tax during the year. Or stated differently, of your withholding, typically your withholding is going to be 90% of your current tax bill. And that's something you want to share with your clients, because a lot of times it's very frustrating at the end of the year. You work all year, you've got withholding, you think things are good, and then you get clobbered with a large tax bill. And what that means is you want to forego that for next year, and again make those estimated tax payments or have additional withholding. When you're making payments, again, it's not a pleasant topic, but if you owe tax, you want to make that payment, because when you're talking about California, if you owe individual income tax to the state of California, the state has 20 years, 20 years to collect. That's a long time. And so what that means is the state's probably going to get the tax out of you somehow, some way. But if you owe it, different ways to pay it. If you want to pay by credit card, I guess you can. That's not something that I would advise. But again, sometimes you either want to or have to. If you have the ability to pay all at once, you can go online, and that's probably the quickest way to do it. If you do go online, you want to make sure you indicate to the state of California why you're making this payment. Is it payment on an existing balance? Then you're going to make that. There's different ways you want to indicate that on the Franchise Tax Board website. But the bottom line is, as I always tell people, if you owe California state tax, what you want to do is you want to make some type of arrangements to pay it. And you kind of like a credit card bill. I think this is for most people. If you owe somebody something, you want to pay it off as soon as you can, because obviously there's interest that's going to be charged, and most people want to avoid that. But you want to make that payment. And you don't want to get into a habit of having many bills coming to you from the state of California, because eventually what happens if you don't pay your California tax, then California has certain options. And one option is to garnish your paycheck if you're a wage earner. And there's other options that California can take. So again, I just tell people, if you owe, you want to make those payments, and you want to make those payments as soon as you can to avoid hassle and to avoid interest. Various contact information, and you'll get this from time to time. Hey, what do I do? I've got an issue. And really, at the end of the day, not everybody, but most people can handle their own affairs. Most people. You might have a senior. I know I've had a couple of seniors, ladies, maybe in their late 80s or early 90s, and maybe they need a little extra, guidance or help. And that's okay. You can give them that, give them those recommendations. Do not advocate for them, though. Do not take it on. In some cases, this is separate from VITA. I'll have clients who contact me, and they're low income, they're not VITA clients. And what I'll do is I will take on their case. I will advocate for them, because I can do that as a practitioner. But again, as a VITA practitioner, as a VITA volunteer, you want to share information. And this is how you can share information. They can go to the FTB, they can make their payments of tax. They can make telephone calls to the FTB, and the FTB is pretty responsive, I should say. Or you can write the letter, make the payment. Making payments online is probably the quickest way to go. And then if you have to visit the office, I probably want to call ahead for an appointment. But this is how you can contact the FTB. And this is something I've seen, and I don't know the name of the program, and it's alive and well. Sometimes an individual will have some type of certification or license in California, and they do not file their tax returns, and they should file them. And then what happens is the FTB will send out a notice to the individual based on their license, based on where they live. The FTB estimates they have a certain amount of income. And then the taxpayer gets that. When they didn't have any income, they go, well, what do I do? I said, well, you got a letter from the government. And when you get a letter from the government, that typically means the government wants you to respond. So you want to respond, you write a letter and say, I wasn't working. For example, I had a VITA client. She was a hairdresser in her previous life, and she was no longer doing hairdressing. And she goes, well, I got this letter, Jerry, and they want me to pay tax. I said, all right, well, what we'll do then is we'll share information with you because we don't advocate, but we'll share information. And this is what you can do to notify the state that you did not have any income. And again, there's ways to contact. But again, burying your head in the sand is not the way to do it. Throwing away letters is not the way to do it. Responding to those letters is the way to do it to avoid, again, hassle. And if you owe tax, avoiding interest. Use tax, this is something you're going to ask, and you've asked before if you're a returning volunteer, but if you're new, this means this is something you're going to ask about in the software. If someone's buying a big ticket item, so for example, let's say you buy a recreational vehicle in the state of New Mexico. And let's say sales tax in the jurisdiction in New Mexico is 6%. Then you drive your RV back to California, you're a California resident, and let's say your RV cost you $300,000. You go to the DMV and the DMV says, welcome to California. You paid 6% in New Mexico. In this jurisdiction in California, it's 9%. So the difference is 3%. We need 3% of that $300,000, which is 9,000 bucks. And you say, well, wait a second, I paid sales tax in California or New Mexico. And California says, you did, but you owe more money here because you're using that here in California. And this is something you don't see very often, but when you do, well, then you have to respond to it. But this is a question we do ask. Did the individual have any items that they purchased and they're using in California and they have to pay that use tax? SDI, this is something you don't have to really concern yourself with. SDI is available for not every wage earner, but a lot of wage earners. And so, for example, when I was an IRS employee, I did not pay a penny into SDI. In fact, I don't think I've paid a penny into SDI the entire time I've lived in California, and I've been here for many, many decades. And so for a lot of your VITA clients, they do pay into SDI. They work for a private company. And then what that means is that is a tax because it is compulsory. And when they pay into it, it's going to be reflected on their W-2. You're going to go ahead and enter that data into the software. And then that amount will be carried forward to the Schedule A as an alpha on their federal return. And so you'll see that. And then you also see here where it says California does not allow state or local tax as an itemized deduction on a California return. And then penalties. This is more the education thing. Again, just sharing information with taxpayers. You're going to get this all the time. People are going to ask you. I'm at the VITA site. I get asked all sorts of questions. Jerry, what's the best taco stand around the campus? What's the best place to get insurance? Well, you kind of want to focus on tax. You don't want to spend a lot of time giving them information because you're going to be outside of your lane. So stay in the tax world. You're going to be safe. But when someone asks about penalties, they'll share letters with me from the franchise tax world. Jury, what do I do? I share information with them. These are my VITA clients. And so I tell them if you get a letter from the state of California and they want something from you, and typically they want money, then you want to respond to that letter. And a lot of times there's penalties for various things on a California return. So you can share with them that the taxpayer can request a one-time abatement. And when they request that one-time abatement, if it's honored by the state, then that means the penalty goes away, which is a good thing for the taxpayer. But again, it takes affirmative action. That means the taxpayer's got to sit down and they've got to compose a letter whether you've got to go down to the franchise tax board or make a telephone call. And if you really talk to it or talk to your clients, a lot of clients are able to do this by themselves. And if not, then you can tell them, then go find someone who can help you out. But as I said before, and I've mentioned this a lot because I've seen this, and actually I think I've done this a few times, but you're not supposed to do this. Don't advocate for the clients. When you start advocating for the clients, you're in a different lane and things are probably not going to work out for you. They'll probably work out for the client, but not for you. So just don't advocate. Provide information. You can educate people all day long, but do not advocate for them. Okay, and then just a few things we'll show you in the software when we do a pivot there. But when you're talking about the Schedule CA, Charlie Alpha for the Form 540, there are certain subtractions that you'll make and certain additions that you'll make. And that's based on that conformity and nonconformity topic that we talked about. So for example, when you're talking about a subtraction, an example would be, and this is done automatically by the software, unemployment compensation. You're going to report it on your federal return, and the software will subtract that from the California return because unemployment compensation is not taxed by the state of California. In addition, might be, let's say you have a VITA client who's recently been divorced, and let's say their divorce is finalized in 2023, and the individual is receiving a small amount of alimony, maybe $10,000 a year. That would be an addition on their California return, not taxed by the federal government for a recent divorce, but taxed by the state of California. And that would be, again, an addition. So that would be an increase. So you're going to see that from time to time, either subtraction or an addition. And then when you're talking about itemized deductions, we know that on the federal return, it's a Schedule A as an alpha. And then for California, if the taxpayer actually ends up with itemized deductions, the software is going to start off with the federal itemized deduction. And then they're going to, I should say the software then will determine the amount of the California itemized deductions based on your entries. And so sometimes you'll have California itemized deductions, which is going to be greater than the standard deduction for California. And then we talked about the publication 1001. And again, there's just a lot of different topics when you're talking about conformity and nonconformity. And typically what you'll see at the VITA site, you'll see the Social Security benefits not taxed by the state of California. You'll see alimony taxed by the state of California. You'll see unemployment compensation not taxed by California. You'll see California lottery winnings not taxed by California. And then this is something, it's not a big amount, but it's still an amount. Educator expenses, you'll have usually your public school teachers will take advantage of this. And we explained that to you, I think, a couple weeks ago. Well, it's allowed by the IRS, but for some reason, California doesn't have an educator expense. And so that's going to be one of those automatic changes that the software is going to make. Another one is moving expense. California allows it, and California allows it for anybody who moves. And of course, they have to meet certain provisions, but it's allowed on your California return. Your moving expenses are not allowed on your federal return unless it is a military move. And of course, this with military move, if you're going to help them, that means you have to be certified on the military module. And then you're going to have to ask the military taxpayer, tell me about your reimbursement for your move. And that's all described in the military module. And then again, certain items that are not going to be allowed on a federal return regarding miscellaneous itemized deductions to include some type of expenses to work and not allowed by the IRS or not allowed on a federal return, but allowed by the state of California. Okay, I had a question, I think it was 2 weeks ago about qualified tuition programs. And so I wanted to go through the basics here. And if you needed additional information, then you can find this in the IRS publication 970. And you're going to see a lot of people going to college. And going to college, what that means is they may be eligible for a tax benefit. And typically that's going to be that lifetime learning credit or the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And so the publication 970, it's a very good publication that talks about all the various benefits to include what is called a qualified tuition program, which is discussed in Internal Revenue Code section 529. So when you talk about a qualified tuition program, as it says on the screen here, it allows taxpayers to make a contribution to an account. And the whole idea is to pay for education expenses, or to be more specific, qualified education expenses. And there's a couple of plans, and the ones I've heard about in the past are those prepaid plans. There's also what is called a savings account plan. But again, these are qualified tuition programs. And there's no limitation to AGI. So that means if you're making the big bucks as the contributor, then you can still do that. And then the whole idea behind the contributions is you're making contributions, and the contributions are eventually going to be used by that beneficiary, by that young adult, to pay for qualified education expenses. And the contributions are not deductible on your federal return. And then what happens is at the end of the day, you've made all these contributions. And then, of course, as they say, when the rubber hits the road, that means you've got distribution of earnings. And so if you have a distribution, well, it's going to be excluded from income if it's used for education expenses. And that's the whole idea. So you contributed to the plan, you got the young adult, they're going to college, and they're taking money out of the plan to pay for their tuition and books and things like that. And then the last, not the last item, the item toward the bottom, and I'll just read it verbatim, says when distributions are more than the beneficiary's education expenses, the earnings portion of the excess is included in the beneficiary's income. And so typically what you're going to see that listed on an IRS form 1099-Qs in Quebec. And that's what the taxpayer may bring to the VITA site is a form 1099-Q. And this is how you would determine the taxable portion of the distribution. You're going to compare the distribution to the education expenses. And there's a chart or a small worksheet in publication 970 where you'll actually look at the distributions and again compare them to the qualified education expenses. And that's the basics of a qualified tuition program. Very popular, and again, explained in detail in publication 970. And then Sean will hesitate for a moment and see if there's any questions. Okay. Sean, any questions, or are we
Oh, there's no questions in the chat. I don't know how much you want to talk about college expenses right now.
well, we can talk about it, and this also pertains to the American Opportunity Tax Credit. When an individual says, "Hey, I went to college," and they want to take advantage of one of the credits, what you want to do is you want to again develop the fact pattern. They're usually going to have the 1098 T as in Tango, which is the tuition statement. But a lot of times, and I say a lot of times because this is not the case every time. But a lot of times you've got students that will purchase textbooks for the college experience. So for example, a couple of years ago, I teach college part-time, and every student at this college that I teach at, and there are thousands of them, every one of them had free textbook for I think the entire year. This very well-to-do lady donated $25 million to the college. And so in that particular case, there is no out-of-pocket expenses for textbook, but typically you're going to see out-of-pocket expenses. And so when someone has out-of-pocket expenses for tuition, for books, for fees, you want to address that. Again, develop that fact pattern when someone says, I went to college and I paid all of this. And those go to what are called qualified education expenses. Now, we know from our discussion on the American Opportunity Tax Credit and the Lifetime Learning Credit, room and board is not considered, and neither is an apartment rent. And so there's certain things that are not considered qualified education expenses. But again, develop the fact pattern, and your go-to document for your expenses, your laundry list of education expenses is going to be your publication 4012. And then sometimes again, you're going to have that discussion back and forth, because sometimes and I'll be the first to admit, if someone purchases a computer for college, of course, it depends. So for example, let's say you've got someone, and now we're talking more of the American Opportunity Tax Credit. Someone has gone to college and they purchased a computer for college, and they use it for college. Well, that's part of their education expenses. Now, of course, if they purchase a computer and they only own one computer and that's it, well, then we know that if you own a computer, you're also using it for personal reasons. So now there has to be some type of allocation. So that's that back and forth, or that discussion that you're going to have to have. But typically, when you're talking about education expenses, it's tuition, fees, maybe laboratory fees of some kind, books, and it might even go into supplies. But again, your publication 970 does a really good job talking about the qualified education expenses. And then, of course, in your publication 4012 does a good job talking about that also.
So Jerry, the one trouble that we ran into more than a few times in the last couple of years at St. Killian was we'd get students, usually from the community college, sometimes from the state college, who got a 1098 saying that they had a scholarship that was a lot more than their tuition expenses. And the students would say, well, I never got that money. The school still has that money. And we said, well, we have to enter it as we see it. And that counts as income. So I don't know if you know how to deal
I
with
think the
that.
short answer to that comment is yeah, that's usually how it works. But again, you want to develop that fact pattern, because if someone says I got a scholarship, you want to know what happened to the scholarship. But if they receive more monies than their tuition, then okay. Well, here's another thing. Now you got to get a little geeky here, if you will. If the individual did not receive the money, that means they do not have what is called actual or constructive receipt. And then you get into a little bit more of a developed fact pattern. This is important when you're talking about education expenses. You want to stay in scope. And so that means you get into your publication 4012 to determine, are we able to help this individual with these questions? And if we are, great, we can do that. If not, then again, that's out of scope. But again, I would say develop the fact pattern. And for me, when someone says, I did not receive the scholarship, okay, then I would look at, okay, actual or constructive receipt. And if they didn't, then you might be able to work with that individual.
Okay.
All right. Sean, this might be a good time to take some questions, because after we come back, we're going to jump into the software.
Well, there was questions about whether housing or rent off campus was covered, but you've already answered that.
Yeah, and you're going to get this. People say, "Well, hey, in order to go to college, I got to pay for my apartment." And you would acknowledge that, and say, "Yeah, I got it. I had to do the same thing when I was a college kid." But when you're talking about this particular tax credit, your rent is not considered part of qualified education expenses. And so you just have to stay very technical. And if you stay technical and you educate your client, your VITA client, it's not like they're going to be happy about it, but they're going to understand. And that's one thing
Right.
about the taxes. Taxes can be very convoluted. They can sometimes be very complex. They can be frustrating, they can be unfair, but if you explain the provisions to people, then they'll say, okay, I got it. And if you can show them on a document, like for example, when I'm talking about education expenses, people say, why is that? Well, I can go ahead and rattle off Internal Revenue Code sections and Treasury regulations, but I usually show them the Pub 970, say here, page 14, paragraph 6. This is what you're talking about. So this explains what you need to know. And that's all. You sharing information with them. Not advocating, but sharing information.
Okay, thanks. Do you
All
want to
right.
do you want to take a break now or keep going?
I think at this point, what I'll do is let's take our 10 minutes. We come back and then we'll jump into the software.
All right then. I'll pause the recording.
Okay, we are back, and what we're going to do now, we're going to go through the Trevino exercise, and this is for a married filing joint return for Mario and Lisa Trevino. Okay, so if you're newer, you're going to be utilizing the practice lab, and the whole idea behind the practice lab, this gives you an opportunity to utilize the software. The practice lab looks very familiar, or very similar, I should say, to the actual software that you'll be using at the VITA site. And I think we mentioned this a few weeks ago when you're talking about the practice lab. If you want to utilize some of the tutorials, you can go to section 4. This is down here on the left-hand side, and you can go ahead and review those tutorials. Some of them are very short, some are a little longer, 9 or 10 minutes, and they'll give you information about preparing a return in the software. And then, of course, if you want additional practice returns, you can see the various practice returns in section 6. You can stay away from the married filing separate one. We don't do that in the VITA program. If you are going to prepare military returns or certify, of course, you want to check with your site coordinator, see if that's necessary. And there's a practice return in section 6 for military. Okay, we're going to go to our software. And if you are starting a return, then you would, of course, indicate start a new return and make your entries. I've already entered data, so we're going to walk through this and then talk through our Trevino return. So we're going to open it up and we're going to find our taxpayer. And you can see right now, I've got the 2024 return. And so we're going to change it to 2023. And this is something that I've only made this mistake maybe 1,000 times before, where I'll start looking for a return or start entering data. You got to start with the right year. And typically in the VITA program, we're doing the current year, but in some cases, you may have a previous return that you're doing, or maybe you're going to do 2 years. Maybe you're going to prepare a tax year 2023 and 2024. But in this case, for instructional purposes, we're going to operate with a 2023 return, and we're going to open up our Trevino. And we'll just go through a few things here to kind of reinforce our knowledge. We'll start with the very top. Filing status is again something that you are usually not going to have an issue with. And this is based on usually their marital status at the end of the year. But the one that you're going to spend a little bit of time with will be head of household. And when you're talking about head of household, follow that decision tree in the publication 4012. And of course, if the individual meets all the provisions, then they're eligible for the head of household filing status. So in this case, our taxpayers are filing jointly, which means their marital status at the end of the year. We've got the information pertaining to the taxpayer. This is something you'll see from time to time. You want to make sure you're using the name on the Social Security card, because when your electronic return originator, your ERO, the person who's electronically filing, attempts to e-file the return, If it gets rejected, usually it might be rejected because there's a transposition of names, or maybe there's a nickname, but use the name on the Social Security card. Okay, we've got the information pertaining to their date of birth. And in this case, we mentioned this before, this is a laundry list, and usually you're only going to pick a few things from this particular list. In this case, the individual wanted monies to go to the presidential election campaign fund. And essentially, this is an order by the taxpayer to the federal government to separate or segregate $3 and put it in this fund for those individuals who are running for president, and they're eligible for that particular fund to take monies out and run their campaign. Okay, and then we did talk about digital assets, and I'll be the first to admit this is not rocket science, but the VITA program says that if you have sold or disposed of digital assets, cryptocurrency, this is something that's outside of the scope of VITA, and so you want to make sure you address that. So if someone says I've sold digital assets, we're not able to assist you in the VITA program. Okay, and then we've got the information for the spouse. And then she also wants money to go to the presidential election campaign fund. And then down here, you want to make sure you indicate, again, we only do California returns. We don't do part year returns. We don't do non-California returns. And in the VITA program that I operate at Coastline College, we do have a lot of people that move into California from other states. And we tell them we can do the federal return, but we cannot do the California return. So what that means, we indicate in the software that we're going to file just the federal return. Then we capture all of the phone numbers, because if we have to perfect the return, the ERO or one of the other folks will call the taxpayer. Typically, your VITA volunteers are not going to be calling the taxpayer. It's going to be your ERO or someone who's responsible for making contact to, again, perfect the return. Okay, and we do have a minor child here, so we're going to go to our dependents, and we're going to open up the dependent. In this case, we've got a young girl. She's about 4 or 5, and we got her date of birth. And then typically getting a social for a child is not an issue. That's something they'll have their Social Security card. Most of the individuals at your VITA site will either be United States citizens or resident aliens. So we'll check that. And then we've got our laundry list of relationships. Typically, it'll be a daughter or a son. Sometimes you got someone who's caring for their parents, and they're able to take that particular deduction, if you will. Okay, we got daughter, lives in the home. And then this is something that you may see. You may see a taxpayer with an adult child who's attending college. And if that's the case and they're adult, over 18, and they're full-time according to the college, then you'd indicate here where it says over 18 and going to an eligible educational institution. And of course, if you have additional children, then you would add your children, or it says add a dependent or qualified child. We already talked about the identity protection personal identification number, also known as the IPPIN. And if that's the case, if someone has an IPPIN, what that means is they're able to file electronically. And then this is going to be a review for most of us. So we have a taxpayer that has a W-2. So let's talk about that a little bit. Our W-2, in this particular case, this is a standard W-2. Sometimes you'll get a corrected or an amended W-2. And then this is the mantra that we use in the VITA program. We're going to enter data as we see it on the W-2, whether that be on a piece of paper or some type of electronic device. And so we've got the employer identification number. We enter that data. This individual works at a bank. And then we get to box 1, which is the wages, and in this case, this is the gross income. You can see the difference between box one and box three. And the reason for that difference of $2,000 is the individual has been making contributions, in this case, to a tax deferred savings program. So this would be like a 401k, 401k. And then we've got some tax withheld, federal tax withheld. And you can see that we've got our Social Security tax and our Medicare tax. And this is a plug amount or a set amount. And if it does not correspond to your W-2, then you can make your so-called pen and ink changes just like that, or make it change back. Okay, so again, that's all automatic. You're not going to worry about that. And then this is something you'll see on certain W-2s. There are some individuals that have never paid into Social Security and never will pay into Social Security. And that simply means they've got amounts in box one, and the amount for box three may be zero, and the amount for box four will be zero. And that's for various reasons, because there's many, many different exceptions to Social Security where individuals, like I mentioned to you, that fire captain I know, he never paid a penny into Social Security. They have their own retirement program. So you're going to see that from time to time. And then down here, this is that amount that we talked about a couple weeks ago. The D is in Delta, which is deferred compensation. And there's different deferred compensation plans. You might have heard of 401B. That's Internal Revenue Code Section 401, 403B, I should say. There's a 401K, there's a 403B, there's a 414, there's a 457. There's different deferred compensation programs. And that's typically what you'll see, D is in Delta. If you also had Delta Delta DD, that would be the amount of the insurance that's paid, premiums paid by the employer on behalf of the employee. So in this case, we have D, deferred compensation. And in this case, again, we'll key it as we see it. Individuals has a retirement plan. Go to box 14. We've got SDI. And usually you're going to see this on returns, or I should say W-2s, but not everybody pays into SDI, but a lot of people do. And so in this case, we're going to indicate that. Then we're going to go down toward the bottom. And usually box 16 is going to be the same as box 1. And I think I mentioned before, when I was living and working in Cuba, I had to pay income tax to the federal government, i.e. the U.S. government, and I did not pay any income tax to the state of California. So my box 16 was different that year. But typically 16 and box 1 are going to be the same. Your employer state ID number is going to be different than your federal state ID number, and that'll be reflected on the W-2. And then state income tax withheld, that's box 17, and that is carried over, if you will, to the Schedule A as an alpha, and also to the California state return, and that's withholding. 18, 19, and 20 you don't use in California because we have no jurisdictions, local jurisdictions that have individual income tax. All right, if you had another W-2, you'd go to the upper right-hand corner and indicate W-2. All right, we're going to go to unemployment compensation. And this is a good thing for the software. The software will automatically, obviously, when you make the entries, automatically make sure on the California return, this is a subtraction on California. California doesn't tax unemployment compensation. And so we open this up, we key it as we see it on the 1099-G as in golf. And you're not going to see a lot of unemployment compensation compared to a couple, 2 or 3 years ago. During COVID, this is a big thing, but not so much anymore. But again, people still become unemployed for various reasons. And you can see you're going to key it as we see it. In this case, we've got unemployment compensation for Lisa to the tune of $8,000. And a lot of times tax is not withheld. And when tax is not withheld, sometimes the taxpayer ends up owing at the end of the year. And that's all we need to do there. We're going to also indicate, obviously, this is for the spouse, Lisa. And we're done with our 1099 G as in golf. Okay, and then another thing we had on our 1090, excuse me, on our fact pattern, we also had the individuals paid a tax practitioner for tax preparation. So we go down to now this is the federal return that we're going to enter data. We already know from our discussion earlier, on your federal tax return, you cannot take a deduction or an itemized deduction for tax preparation fees. So what we do is we enter it here, and what happens is it's carried forward to the state return, the California state return. So we open this up, and this is where we would make the entries, where it says state-only deduction, and that would be that tax return preparation fees. And that's who you'd make that deduction or entry. And if you had someone who's got a safe deposit box, sometimes they have a safe deposit box for wills and other documents. That's something you can deduct on your state return if you itemize on your state return. And then sometimes you have an individual who pays investment fees. So for example, I've got a couple of portfolios, and I think one of them, if I remember correctly, is with Edward Jones, and I forget what I pay them. It's a modest amount each year. And so that's an investment fee that I would enter here on the software, which carries forward to the California return because I do itemize on my California return. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to open that up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to the health insurance. And in the fact pattern, our taxpayers were enrolled in Covered California. And you can see over here on the right-hand side, we have a taxpayer of very modest means. And you're going to see this. And if you're new or newer to VITA, sometimes you're going to shake your head and say, how does someone live in Southern California, specifically Orange County, specifically Mission Viejo, on $28,000 a year? Well, if you're receiving perhaps maybe some type of grants or subsidies from the state and or federal government, or maybe your parents, or maybe you have very low housing costs, you can live on a modest amount of money. It just depends. But again, we're not auditors. We're not going to do a lot of digging on their support, but we are going to look at their income for the purposes of the VITA program. Okay, we're going to go over here to health insurance, and this is something you'll ask every taxpayer. The 1095 Alpha is issued by Covered California. The Form 1095 Alpha is an information return. It is an IRS return. And again, if you're in Covered California, you have subsidized insurance. And in this particular case, the taxpayers did get a 1095A. So we're going to indicate yes. And we're going to hit continue. This particular screen talks about what is called the so-called tax household. And this includes mom, dad, and daughter. And then there's a number of questions, and this is from your tax year 2023, so there may be some small differences going into 2024. So whatever the question is, you address it. Typically, when you talk about allocating a policy, the answer will be no. When you're talking about repayment of the advance premium tax credit, typically the answer is no. And then here it says, does the 1095A include coverage for January through December with no changes? In other words, all of the amounts for the entire year are the same. And if that's the case, in this case it is, you're going to indicate yes. If it's not, you'd indicate no. And then you can see this drop-down screen, then you would populate each and every month. And you would take this directly off the form 1095A. Okay, so the answer was yes. We're going to go back. And then you can see, and I'll make this a little bit larger so you can see it. It says enter your amount, and this is from the 1095A, line 33 Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So in this case, let me go ahead and enter the data here. All right, so we've entered the data for the 1095 alpha. And then it brings us to another screen that talks about household income. And we're going to just answer the questions. It talks about AGI for the dependent. Well, this is a little girl, so she doesn't have any income. This form right here, you're not going to work with it, but just FYI, this is called the Foreign Earned Income Exclusion, the IRS Form 2555. And if you're certified on the international module, you'll work with that. Okay, so all of these answers are 0. We enter that and we hit continue. All right, so we've addressed the W-2 income, we've addressed the unemployment compensation, we've addressed the 1095A, we've entered information regarding the tax preparation that was conducted and the individual paid. And then we're talking about a refund that the individual receives. So we're gonna address that real quick.
Hey, Jerry, before you get too far, there is a question in the chat about the disability income.
Okay, and
Uh,
what's the question?
um, there was, you mentioned a taxable grant box, and somebody's just asking, what is that?
Taxable grant box. I don't
Maybe you were
recall.
just going through the screen really fast, and there was a
Oh, you're talking about the health insurance?
on. Well, the question is, what was that taxable grant box on disability income?
Okay. I don't recall that.
Okay,
Can you ask the individual specifically
sure.
what slide they were talking about? Was it the 1095 alpha?
Uh, I'm asking.
Okay. All right. While you find that out, I'm going to go back to our federal section. And this is something you're going to see on a lot of returns. People will come to you and they'll say, I got a tax refund from the state of California. And you'll say, okay. And then they're going to ask you, do I have to pay income tax on that? And the answer is, now we're talking for our VITA site, you're going to be pairing mostly 2024 returns. So they're going to come to you with a 2024 1099 from the state of California. And then, again, they're going to ask you, is this taxable? And the answer would be if they itemized on their federal return in the previous year and they took a tax benefit, then some or all of that refund is going to be taxed on their federal return. So this is where you would go to answer that question. You'd go to the 1099 G as in golf. And once you determine in the previous year they took they had a Schedule A itemized deductions, then you would start answering these questions where it says state refund. You'd enter that amount. And then you would look at their previous year return. That would be the Schedule A from the previous year, the Schedule A on the Form 1040. And you'd answer these questions where it says prior year taxes. And it asks about line 5 delta, line 12 in the Form 1040, line 5 alpha. So you'd enter all this data. And the whole idea is you're trying to tell the software, I need you to calculate the taxable amount of the state tax refund that's going to appear on the federal return based on these entries. So you would populate this particular screen. I'll go to the top again, and this is where it says state and local refund worksheet. And again, this addresses what is called the tax benefit rule. And then toward the very bottom, you would also indicate the filing status from the previous year. And there's your drop-down menu. And you'd also indicate if the individual was a senior. When I use the term senior, we're talking about someone who's 65 or older. And of course, if they're 65 or older, you'd indicate that. Or if they're blind according to the tax definition of blindness. And if that's the case, you would indicate that from the previous year. And then the software will calculate the amount of the state tax return that's taxable on the federal return. Sean, did you find
Yeah.
that answer?
Yeah. So he said it was referring to the disability form. I don't remember. Maybe there was one of the screens we were going through, but there's another question that you might be able to answer more quickly. When you were going through the drop down for the 1095 and answering all the questions month by month, someone asked, is it the same procedure for a 1095 Bravo?
Oh, the short answer is for the 1099B as in Bravo, you're not going to attend to that because let me go back to that. Health insurance, this is what you need to do. You need to determine, does the individual have minimum, what is called minimum essential health coverage, or basically health coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Many ways to get it. And if the person says, yes, I've got coverage through the Veterans Administration, I got coverage through work, I got coverage through a broker, and I'm paying out of pocket, then the answer is, okay, great. If they are in covered California, they're going to be issued a 1095 alpha, which means you have to conduct a reconciliation. And so you're going to get that 1095 alpha, and that's the only form you're going to use to make entries into the software. Otherwise, if they have a 1099B or a 1099C, they got coverage. I stand corrected at 1095 A or B. I still stand corrected at 1095 B or C. There we go, B or C. You're not going to worry about it. You're only going to make your entries here for a 1095A. So back here.
Well, I wouldn't say you're not going to worry about it because if the 1095B only has partial year coverage, then you may have to ask some questions and there may be, penalties for not having coverage.
Sure, you're going to develop a fact pattern. The vast majority of your VITA clients are either going to be low income or indigent, and they're not going to afford it. So the vast
Yeah.
majority of them are not going to pay that individual share responsibility
Yeah.
payment. Okay, so back here, maybe this answers the question regarding disabilities. So we have our household members, our tax household. We answered all of these questions in the software regarding 1095A. And in this particular case, we've got our 1095A amounts for 33 Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. And that comes right off of the 1095A. I don't know, Sean, if that answers the question regarding disability. I still can't figure the question out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that form was. There's another question that's relevant to the form you were just filling out for the federal tax liability on previous years. The person asked, what if we don't have their prior year tax forms?
Well, if you don't have the prior year tax form, then you're going to ask them, taxpayer, did you itemize in the previous year? Did you take an itemized deduction on the Schedule A, your Form 1040? And if the taxpayer says, no, I didn't, then that would be sufficient to say, okay, then your California state tax refund is not going to be taxed on your federal return for this year. All right. So we got that. Okay, so now let's jump into the California return here. And we have to get past these particular questions. This format may be a little bit different between tax year 2023 and 2024, but we're going to get past all of this. This is that minimum essential coverage. These are questions regarding per year return, name changes. The answer is typically going to be no. Renter's credit, a lot of people take advantage of it. This organization, The CDTFA is the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. They're the sales tax people in California. That's one of the things they do. This is at minimum essential healthcare coverage, and a lot of people will have it. Low income individuals, a lot of them have either covered California or Medi-Cal. And then we're going to hit continue and go past this. And now we're at the section where it says California return. You may have to get into your California return. Your additions to income. This might be where you would enter alimony. And then you go to other additions. And that's where you might have to do alimony. You don't see a lot of alimony, but you might. And then we're going to go to what are called subtractions. And this is where you're going to see a lot of subtractions. So for example, let's go back to that California lottery that we talked about. Again, what we're doing here is we're actually subtracting gross income from the California return that was reported on the federal return, and it's not done automatically. And you can see there's a laundry list of things here. And then we're going to get down to California lottery winnings. We're going to enter an amount there. So let's say the taxpayers won some money on the California lottery and they reported it on their federal return. Then here in the California return, they would enter amount. And then what would happen is the software would subtract that California lottery income from their California return, which is a good thing on their California return for them. And then other subtractions, it depends on whether or not if you have another subtraction. But again, develop the fact pattern. Sometimes taxpayers will know because they filed the previous return. They go, hey, I've got an item here of income that is not taxed by the state of California. And they may even reference that Franchise Tax Board publication 1001. All right, we're going to come back. And then this is something you're going to spend a little time with. It's the healthcare shared responsibility tax. We're going to open that up. And then if you have someone who has health coverage for the whole year, you're going to simply answer yes, and you're going to move on. And if they don't have coverage for the whole year, then you might want to find an exemption for them, or maybe they're going to make a shared responsibility payment. So let's open that up. And you can see, now again, this may be a little bit different for 2024, depends on when that software comes out. But you want to go ahead and most likely find an exemption. And that exemption might be perhaps maybe they can't afford it. And so let's show you an example. So let's say we're going to select the husband in this case, Mario, and we're going to find a code. So this is what I've done for many, many VITA clients. I usually find where it's not affordable. So maybe there's a general hardship, something like that. We've got folks who are incarcerated. That could be an example. Or coverage is considered unaffordable. That's usually the one I pick because I develop the fact pattern. I ask some questions. And you don't have to be an accountant. I guess it helps, but you can ask people what are their total revenue sources for the year? What are their total expenditures for the year? And then you say, you know something, there's no way you can afford this. So this is an example where you can take that exception that we talked about, unaffordability, which means they're not going to be subject to that penalty that California asserts because they don't have insurance. And again, this is important when they come to the VITA site. If they say they've got insurance, usually they're going to have a card. Like, so for example, I've got two insurance policies. So I've got two insurance cards. And so someone asked me, Jerry, do you have insurance? Yes, I do. Which one do you want? You want both of them or one of them? And a lot of times you're going to have someone that has an insurance card, maybe one or two, depending on the policy they have. And again, if they're covered by Covered California, they have to have the 1095-A for us to prepare a return. Okay, so that's that. Let's go back here. Hopefully that helps you out. You can see the full year where it says if they don't have full year coverage, then maybe it was unaffordable for the first 6 months and then they got a job toward the latter part of the year. And this is what I do at my site. When someone comes to me and says they couldn't afford it, I ask them a bunch of questions and I usually go, here, you can't afford it. And you can see this is going to be for each taxpayer and for each month of the year. And this can be a really sensitive subject when you're talking to people. And that's why you have to be not only patient, you have to have empathy, because there are certain people, because of various reasons, they don't have the means to buy certain things. And it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It doesn't mean they're ignorant. It simply means they're in a situation right now they can't afford it. And so these are delicate questions. So you just simply ask them, you be very factual. Why couldn't you afford it? Well, I couldn't afford it because I had to buy food, I had to pay rent. Makes sense to me. But again, develop the fact pattern. What is your revenue for the year? What's your income for the year? And what were your expenses for the year? And if you're paying $1,700 for an apartment and you're making 2,500 bucks a month, well, then that means you probably, after you buy food and insurance and everything else and clothing, you can't afford insurance. That's probably that unaffordable thing that we talked about. Okay, we're going to back out of here and continue. And let's see, what else do we need to talk about? I think that's it as far as the California turn. Now what we're going to do, we're gonna exit. We're going to go to the form that we created, the PDF form. So I'm going to back out of that. So Sean, hold on a second. Let me stop and load up the return itself. Okay, if I've got it loaded here. Here we go. I think this is it. Okay, Sean, can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so we're going to point out a couple things on the return that we have generated from the Trevinos. Try not to make you too dizzy here. If you're newer to VITA, you'll generate that PDF. And what we do in the program, we give a hard copy courtesy return to the taxpayer, so they have that for their records. And the vast majority of returns we electronically file. So
And
this is your roll up right here.
Jerry, last time I checked the system in the practice lab wasn't generating these yet. I don't know if they fixed that.
You mean for 2024?
Yeah. Yes.
That could be because it's a work in progress. So this is your roll up, if you will, and you can see right here on the California return, we can see there's a minus 8,000. That's that unemployment compensation that we subtracted, or it was subtracted by the software. This is one of those automatic things. And then you can see the total amount due, nothing's due, but they're going to get a refund. And this is a pretty generous refund. This is pretty typical of a lot of our VITA clients are walking out with a large refund. This is a big thing for them. And that way they can go ahead and pay their bills and take care of their kids. I'm not going to talk about every screen, but a few screens. This is a facsimile. And you can see we entered the data pertaining to their W-2 gross income. They had their tax deferred program to the tune of $2,000. And this is another thing. Again, we educate, we don't advocate. But if an individual asks about deferred compensation, I'll talk to them all day about what deferred compensation is and what that means to them, whether it be 2 years in the future or 40 years in the future. It's deferred, which means they can contribute to some type of savings plan. And then when they take a distribution, that distribution is going to be a taxable event. And of course, when they reach a certain age, there's no penalties on an early distribution. You can see right here, that was that state tax of $500, state tax withheld. This right here is the what we call the global carry forward, which means if somebody wants a global carry forward, they can go to another VITA site. And what happens is there's a lot of time that's saved on tax preparation. And it simply means yes or no. And a lot of people want that. And so when they do indicate they want it, we indicate that in the software, and there's a PIN that's assigned to them, a PIN. This is something that's non-negotiable. If they want e-filing, they have to sign the 8879, both state and federal, and then we will e-file the return for them. Here is your 1040, and for instructional purposes, we're looking at the 2023 right now. You can see the administrative data is at the top. We've got the daughter, and you can see the child tax credit is automatically calculated for her. She's a young girl. She's about 4 or 5. We've got our W-2 wages reflected on the return. We've got our unemployment compensation on line 8, which is taxed by the federal government. We have our standard deduction, our federal deduction of almost 28,000, which offsets or gobbles up most of that adjusted gross income. And you can see right here, their taxable income is $300. Their tax is $31, and then of course they have non-refundable credits of $31 that's accounted for. So they actually end up with a total tax liability of 0, which means they don't owe any federal income tax. Now, of course, they've had withholding, and you might remember from a few weeks ago, they're eligible for that earned income tax credit because they're lower income and they've got that child, that young lady, and then they also get the additional child tax credit, which is a refundable credit. So this is very typical of a lot of the VITA returns that we prepare. So in this case, they've got their total payments to include federal tax withheld and their various credits of almost $7,200. They owe 0 individual income tax, and now they have a refund of almost $7,200, and that's just on the federal side of the house. A quick point here. Again, we're going to do finishing return next week. And when we finish a return, we're going to typically enter bank information for the client because that's what the client wants. They want direct deposit. And if that's the case, we capture their bank information from them. All right, we'll talk about a few of these. This is that unemployment compensation reported on the federal return. Nothing more on that line. The additional credits, we see that the retirement savings contribution credit, this is something that you may have read about, and lower income individuals are going to get this when they contribute to some type of savings plan. And you can see it's $31. And the reason it's only $31 is the total amount of tax they had was $31. So the non-refundable credit can only be up to the tax. And so it's calculated at $31. And then here, let's see if we can describe this for you. This is what is called the net premium tax credit. This is for that Affordable Care Act, i.e. the Covered California. So if someone's in Covered California and they receive too little of a taxpayer subsidy, they're going to receive this net premium tax credit. And this is a non-refundable credit. Schedule A, itemized deductions, doesn't pertain because they take the standard deduction. EITC, this is an involved form. It's automatic. Software's going to calculate it for you automatically. And you can see right there, this is for the child. That credit that we talked about, and this also is a child tax credit and the additional child tax credit. This is reflected on this schedule 8812. Try not to make you too dizzy. Here we go. Here's the credit for qualified retirement savings contribution. And this is something you'll see a lot of lower income folks, thankfully, who are saving for their retirement. You can see the amount there. Here's that premium tax credit. Again, you'll see this again and again because you have insufficient subsidy. And this is another takeaway when you're in covered California. If something big changes in your life, you get divorced, you get married, you have kids, kids grow up and move out of the house, you move, your income goes up a lot, your income goes down a lot. You want to go back into covered California and make changes to that because that affects the amount of your subsidy that you're receiving from the taxpayers. All right. And we're going to get to that California return and have a brief discussion there. Okay, here's our California return. And you can see the amount of the exemption, which is on line 7. So we have mom and dad, and there's a total amount there. We have the amount for the daughter, and that is reflected on line 10. And you can see total exemptions are 734. We can have the state wages of that 20,000. We subtracted the 8,000 of unemployment compensation. Software did that automatically. We end up with California adjusted gross income of 20,000. And this is important. Your California adjusted gross income may be and typically is different than your federal adjusted gross income. And of course, we also have what is called the standard deduction. And in this case, that's at 10,000 and change. And so our taxable amount is a little over almost 9,300. Our tax on that is $93. And then what happens is we have these exemptions, and these exemptions are non-refundable. So they gobble up that $93 of tax, and there's no resulting tax, which means they're not entitled to that non-refundable renter's credit. And so you can look on line 64. Line 64 is your total tax liability, which is 0. They have withholding of $500. They're going to get that back. They have California EITC. They have California, that young child tax credit. And so their total payments are $1,705, and that's going to result in their refund of $1,705. And then you can see over here, obviously they had health insurance for mom, dad, and the child. So there's no individual share responsibility payment that's calculated on their California return because they had full coverage and they're good to go there. So they end up with that refund of $1,705. And that's reflected there. And then a lot of times you might have someone who wants to donate money to some type of contribution fund, some type of worthwhile organization. And in California, the FTB has a laundry list of funds they can donate to. And so what this does, this will reduce the amount of their refund if they have a refund coming to them. And so this may come into play where someone wants to make that donation. All right, and then just one more thing. Let's go to the itemized deductions. Again, that's the amount of the refund, line 115, $1,705. If they had some type of account, direct deposit, that data would be captured down here. You'd make the entry and it would carry forward to the return. And let's go to the itemized deductions. They don't have itemized deductions. This is that California Form CA, where you can see the federal amount, and then you have the various subtractions. And then sometimes you may have an addition, i.e. the alimony is an addition. if the taxpayer is itemized, and let's run down to the itemized deductions. You would see something like this. This is your itemized deductions. You have to start off with your federal, and then the software will calculate that. And we don't have enough itemized deductions on California, so that's why we take the standard deduction for California. Well, let's show you where that amount for that tax preparation fee is reported for California. And if you had other unreimbursed employee expenses for California, that would be reflected on line 19. All right, so I think that takes care of what we need to take care of. And then Sean, I'm going to throw it back to you. And if we have any questions or comments, and the next week, same time, same bat channel.
Just one last question. Barbara wants you to confirm that the premium tax credit is refundable because she heard it was not refundable.
And I probably have to correct myself there. Let's see here. Yeah, I have to correct myself there. The PTC, the premium tax credit, Barbara is correct. It is a refundable item reflected here on line 31, and that ends up here in that 7191. It is a refundable amount, which is a good thing, meaning the individual received let me restate that. The individual received too little of a subsidy, and then that's where they're going to
Yeah.
get the additional amount, again, a refundable amount. All right, Sean, back to you.
Well, that is it. Unless we have any more questions.
Yeah, I'll
We'll
stay
see
on the line for a
everyone
few
next week.
minutes.
Okay. I'm going to stop the recording now. Oh, what? One more question. If a client has ACA MEC coverage outside of covered California, do they need to have a Form 1095?
If someone is in the Affordable Care Act and they receive a subsidy from the taxpayers, let's say, for example, the state of Nebraska, let's say someone has subsidized health insurance and Nebraska does not have a comparable plan like California. That means because they're subsidized, they're going to receive an IRS Form 1095A. Was that it, Sean? Sean, are you with us?
Thank you, Jerry, for all that you did. This is great information.
All right, that sounds like Damien.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Okay, if there are no other questions, then we'll see everybody next Saturday at 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay.
Okay,
All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.